good afternoon, or good morning. I never know which to say at this point in the day. And welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. We were due to be joined by Muna, the Director for European and Global Affairs at the EPC. She is caught in travel difficulties, but may magically appear on our screens at some point over the next hour. So today, we want to look at an issue that the EPC has been focusing on a lot lately. You, Janis and Fabian, together with Almut, co-authored a paper last autumn arguing that those within the EU who were prepared to do what is needed to rise to the challenges we face might have to explore what you called unconventional forms of cooperation. You also called it a supragovernmental avant-garde, or the term that many people are using now, coalitions of the willing. And you published a paper last week called A Test of Times, Perma-Change Through Enlargement and EU Reform, which began to elaborate a little bit on how this might work in practice. Today, we want to look at this in more detail and how this approach might be applied in response to current geopolitical developments and the key challenges facing the EU in these turbulent times. As always, totally interactive conversation. I will have some questions for Fabian and Janis. Please, if you have a question, put it either in the Q&A box or you can click on the raised hands button. Let us dive straight in. And Fabian, this morning, you have published a commentary, a to-the-point, short, sharp commentary entitled about looking at this whole question of differentiation. And you say in that, differentiated integration has been part of the construction of the EU for a long time. And you point to examples like the Euro and Schengen to illustrate that. There's also been a lot of talk. I've been covering Brussels for 30 years, two-speed Europes, multi-speed Europes. How does that, what has happened in the past, differ from what you are talking about now, this supragovernmental avant-garde or coalition of the willing? How is it different, if it is different? And why do you believe this is an idea whose moment has come?
So I think, firstly, it's important to take a step back and to say, why are we thinking about these unconventional forms? And the key from our perspective is that we have to start with facing the real challenges which we have at the moment, and deciding what is the strategic direction we need to go in. What do we have to do now? Once we have decided that, we can then start looking at what are the instruments we are going to use, what are the mechanisms which we are going to use. And the problem we have then encountered is that the current setup, the current mechanisms we have, don't necessarily allow us to go ahead on some of these crucial issues. Because if we need to have unity, we often have had to sacrifice ambition to get there. So what we then started to think about is what are ways in which we can achieve the necessary ambition, but not having all of the member states on board. And on top of that, having true coalitions of the willing, which might well include countries which are not member states. So this is one area in which this differs from the past. We are very consciously thinking about that in many of these areas, countries which are not yet members of the European Union, or who were members of the European Union but are no longer members of the Union, or who are not intending to become members of the Union, are still having to be integrated into these actions to make them effective. Many of the actions in areas such as defense and security, for example, will have to involve Ukraine, will have to involve UK, will have to involve Norway. So that's one area where we see a big difference here. The other difference is also about excluding deliberately member states from certain policy areas. We have talked in the past about enemies within. that we have a situation where governments in certain countries are actively working against the common interest. They do not want to go ahead in certain areas. So we have to have mechanisms which and also enable us to go ahead, excluding countries if they are not willing to be constructive when it comes to these. And that's different than in the past, because in the past, very often these countries have allowed countries to go ahead if they wanted to integrate further. Here we're talking about countries actively blocking advances going into the future. I think we are also in a world of rather messy competences, where it is not clear that we can talk about an area of traditional European integration. When we look at defense and security as one of the prime examples of this, clearly there's a lot of national competence here. There's a lot of bilateral, multilateral activity. There's NATO, which runs alongside all of this. So this requires new forms of integration. It doesn't simply fit under the old EU umbrella. So that also means that in some areas, this bypasses EU mechanisms, which can make it quicker, can make it more effective, but of course, that's risky as well.
I want to come back to the risks that may be inherent, because you've acknowledged that there are certain risks. But Janis, Fabian also says in his to the point commentary this morning, driven by necessity, such far-reaching coalitions of the willing are not a sideshow. They are the motors of European integration in the years to come. From your perspective, how important is it to really look at this issue through these fresh eyes, as you have done, but also how the link between this discussion and the future of democracy in Europe? Because you have made the argument in previous papers on this topic. You talk about European democracy being at stake, particularly in response to Trump 2.0. How do you see the link between those two things?
Let me start with the first question, which adds up to what Fabian was saying. Obviously, we already have a differentiated Europe, but we're living under totally different circumstances. And we see that also being expressed in much more talk in town, but also in member states, in national capitals and beyond, about coalitions of the willing. But what exactly we mean, we're not spelling out. And I think, yes, it has the potential. It has had the potential already in the past to move European cooperation forward. If you look into Schengen, for example, but not only, also the area of defense. So you need to be more concrete when you talk about coalitions of the willing and what needs to be done or what could be done within the EU treaties or outside the EU treaties. And I don't think that this is being done to the extent which is necessary. There is more of a reflex of saying, we can do it intergovernmentally. Do we really need to involve the EU, for example? You hear that very often. And I think that bears some risk, which I think we're going to discuss later. So we need to be much more concrete when we talk about coalitions of the willing, what exactly we have in mind, and also, by extension, of what we should try to avoid. Now, with respect to European democracy, I think, yes, liberal democracies in Europe, and I mean now Europe both with respect to the EU, but also to the continent in general, is at stake. And if you follow nationalists, nativists, who are not only opponents of liberal democracy, they are often also opponents of the EU as we know it. They want to hollow out the EU as we know it, coming forward with the false political argument that we need to make my country, from their perspective, great again. And that follows in the logic that we need to undermine the EU, and we need to, that the EU is a burden in our efforts to make our country, my country, great again. That's their logic. Saying this is the wrong logic, but that's the logic they're following. In this situation, if pro-European liberal Democrats, the EU in itself, cannot counter that, cannot showcase that the EU is able to deliver, that the EU can actually make a difference. That is something which illiberal forces will use as an argument. They will say, look, we have been telling you that the EU is not delivering, so follow our argument to make our countries great again by following an illiberal democratic course. If you listen to Orban, but also to many others, and by the way, also if you listen to the follow the US debate, this is the argument they're making. So the result is that the EU and its member states need to be, as Fabian was saying, more ambitious, and they can only do that if they also are ready to do things outside the EU framework or within the EU framework, going beyond those who are vetoing certain progress in certain policy areas. And so there is, I think, a direct link, and that's also a dilemma. It's also a dilemma, by the way, which traditional pro-European liberal forces are facing, because obviously they're feeling the sentiment in their countries, which is concentrate on ourselves, be more egoistic, maybe you don't use the word nationalistic, but concentrate on our interest. Don't succumb to the interest of others. That argument is very strong. That makes it difficult for national, even pro-Europeans to act at the European level, and that has then a negative effect. So there's a negative spiral, a negative political spiral, which needs to be broken. And I think that coalitions of the willing, if they are of the right sort, are a way to counter that potential development or that trend, which you already see, to be frank.
Okay. And I want to get very concrete in a moment about how it might work, what it might mean. But can I just ask one other question, Fabian, in relation to your commentary this morning? You said, with Europe now caught between Russia and Trump, a form of hybrid functionalism has become the norm. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've always had this idea of European integration as a rules-based, a Monet method-based progress where we move forward by creating the institutions and the legal framework around them. What I'm trying to say here is that we live in a world where needs must, where we really have to say we use whatever method will get us to where we need to get to. So very much driven by what the final outcome needs to be. And that also means that we have to move on a bit from this idea of European integration only being this one process which culminates in the European Union at the end.
So Janis, let us get concrete and spell out what we're talking about. You talked about it being outside the framework, within the framework. Fabian, they're saying we need to use whatever method will get us to where we need to go. In practice, do you envisage this more being something that is done within or beyond the framework because of some of the limitations of doing it within? And also, why did you choose the term governmental, not supranational, but super governmental avant-garde? And now you're calling it open super governmental avant-garde. You've added that word to it. Can you explain what you mean by that and why you didn't just say coalitions of the willing?
I'll come to that by starting with your initial point you raised, because yes, in principle, there are two ways how you can organize coalitions of the willing. You can organize them within or outside of the regular EU framework. Within the framework of the EU, and that's what many, by the way, argue also makes the EU enlargement and future-proof, you have instruments of differentiated integration. You have the instrument of enhanced cooperation. You have the instrument of PESCO in the area of defense. But if you look into the experience since the entry of the Lisbon Treaty, these instruments have not been used or have not been used extensively. Only in very concrete issues they have been used or they were thought to be used. And the argument of why or the reasons why they have not been used are multiple. One is they are complex instruments. They require a lot of preconditions need to be fulfilled in order to have enhanced cooperation working. They need to make sure that they don't undermine, for example, the single market. So there are tough rules in order to start, for example, enhanced cooperation. That makes it difficult. But if there's political will, I think you could move on. But we see that there's a lack of political use to use these instruments. And that also goes to the fact that some member states in the past have not been ready to use them because they were not ready to enhance, deepen their cooperation among them by using these instruments. So the question is, will they do now? I have the idea that they are not ready to do it, but because if you use the instrument of enhanced cooperation within the EU treaty framework, that would also strengthen the EU institutions. And you hear a lot, for example, in the context of defense. Do we really want EU institutions? Do we want the Commission to be stronger when it comes to this? Do we want the European Parliament to have a stronger say? Or is this not undermining our national intergovernmental efforts? Then there's also one specific problem, by the way, which sounds very legal, but is political in the end. If you would start an enhanced cooperation, the rules which apply to the EU in that policy field also apply to enhanced cooperation. So if you have unanimity in the area of defense or in other areas where there are unanimity rules, you would also have these rules in enhanced cooperation. This is why some say that those who are ready to use enhanced cooperation should put together a treaty among themselves. Jean-Claude Péris then calls this a political community where they agree that they would be using qualified or some form of super qualified majority voting when it comes to deciding within enhanced cooperation. But that already shows you that if you move in that direction, you already create a much bigger division between member states within the EU framework.
And also you have to overcome certain rigidities all the time as a constant.
Yes. So that is why I think for a good number of reasons, even if it's not the preferable number one option, maybe the preferable in order to fulfill what Fabian was saying, to deliver on certain challenges we need to deliver on, is to work outside the EU treaty. Right. But then again, the question comes up of how do you do that? We have very loose coalitions who are only intergovernmental, where member states, EU institutions are being sidelined. That's not what we have in mind when we talk about a supra-governmental avant-garde. And the supra-governmental is exactly doing what the name says. It is linking the supranational elements of the EU. It makes sure that, for example, EU institutions, including the Commission, the Parliament, play a role in those coalitions of the willing, while at the same time also using the fact that there's more flexibility because you do it in an intergovernmental fashion.
Gotcha.
And there are certain principles you need to adhere to.
We'll come back on the principles later.
So that, I think, is why an supra-governmental avant-garde could be the smartest of solutions, rather than going for coalitions outside of the EU treaty, which does not adhere to the principles we'll be discussing later. And by the way, and the discussion about differentiation is old, there have even been some, and there are some who now even speculate about this these days, that maybe there's a need to create a new union. If you have outside of the union, creating a new union. If you have massive opposition from certain member states, which you cannot overcome, maybe you need to think much more radical. I think that is not the best of options.
Okay.
So that's why I'm saying you need to be much more concrete.
Come back on that in a moment. And I do want to very shortly link this to current geopolitical developments when we talk about where this might work, and you've already touched on it a bit, Fabian. But I don't know, Fabian, whether you wanted to add anything in terms of how you see the balance. You said we have to use whatever method gets us to where we need to go. Is your sense, and I think from what you wrote this morning, your sense is this will happen more often outside the EU framework than within it?
I think what we are already starting to see is a variety of these coalitions of the willing springing up all over the place, because it's not possible or not desirable to do them within the framework, because we should also take into account that very often on the member state level, it's not necessarily that they want to put this through the European framework. So I think it is happening. The exception is becoming the rule. But I would also stipulate that if we do this in a more organized way, in a more structured way, there will also be a certain level of possible buy-in from countries who might see that something is happening, that something is being created close to the institutions, close to the framework, but not involving them. And it might act as also an incentive to take part, and eventually also possibly to bring it back under the EU fold. So we've
So
never...
answering the concern that Janis raised that they might have of strengthening the institutions, being close to but not part, you think might be a reassurance on one side. And for those who want the institutions to be strengthened, you say, well, maybe we'll bring it under the umbrella later. So you could satisfy both. Is that what you're saying?
I think you can try to satisfy both, but I don't want to minimize the risk which is inherent in that. This is clearly not something which is ideal in many ways. If we didn't have any constraints, then we would design it differently. But we have to work with the realities which are there, which does mean that member states, that the nation states still carry a lot of the decision-making power. So we have to accommodate that.
Okay, so let us look at, oh, go on, sorry, Janis.
Just one addition, and I think that is important to note in the political discourse. If you follow now the debate, for example, in the area of defense, where there is a discussion as to how far the EU should go. We've been discussing this also in the EPC update in previous editions of it. We often hear that we need to find a compromise among the EU 27, or at least the 26. And at some points, they also say we will also need the 27th. So even if we could find a compromise among the 26, we need to work on trying to reach a compromise among all member states. So we need that unity. And then they argue, and let's be careful that if we use instruments of differentiation, we might undermine the ultimate goal, which is to be united also on the international scene. And I think this is being used by some member states as an argument to hide behind the real reason why they're not ready to further go when it comes to cooperating or even integrating in certain areas like defense. So they use that as an argument in order to pretend that they want to do more, but do not have the ability to do so. So differentiation or coalitions of the willing, if they're done in the right way, and I need to always say that, we always need to say that, are also pressure instruments. And not only pressure instruments on those who we obviously see obstructing, but also those who are not ready to jump into the deep, dark, cool waters and deepen their cooperation among themselves. So let's also have that political debate in mind, because it is important to understand how the coalition of the willings are sometimes being misused also by those who pretend that they're ready to cooperate more.
Thank you. Okay, let us drill down. And you touched, Fabian, in answer to my first question, on one key area where you see this being applicable, namely defence and security. And you mentioned it also in the context of involving non-EU member states, the UK, Norway, Ukraine in that. In what areas, I come later to where you shouldn't allow it and why not, but in what areas not only do you think it is an option, but also possibly the only option, the best way forward? And can we link this very much to where we are now and the conversations around Ukraine, around responses to Trump 2.0 and so on? Where might it be not only the best option, but indeed the only option?
When we look at defense and security, I think it's important to make a distinction between two broad areas. One is support for Ukraine, and the other is building up European capabilities, also in part in response to the messages we are getting from Washington. In both of those areas, I suspect that these coalitions of the willing will be the dominant form of action for the years to come. Not least because we have some countries within the EU which do not want to go in this direction, or who are constitutionally constrained. We shouldn't forget that we also still have neutral countries who have certain limitations in what they can do. I think what it also has in common, both across those two areas, is that they require enormous amounts of money. And when it comes to money, I think we will see very often that coalitions of the willing are the only way of going forward. because if you have to find a huge amount of additional money, that will have to go with certain controls, and it will have to go also with the possibility of excluding some countries from the benefits of that who are not willing to put in the money. So I would suspect that in defense and security, in most areas, these coalitions of the willing are actually the name of the game. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be outside the treaties. Some of that might still be accommodated within the treaties if the countries do not try to block it, who are not taking part. So as in many different areas, what we think in terms of coalitions of the willing, you have to try out how far you can go within the EU framework, but then be willing to say, if this doesn't work within this framework, we go beyond it.
Okay, so that's the process by which you decide which areas to do it. First, you try and stay within the framework, and then you move beyond. Janis, for you, talking a lot here about defence and security, you've both mentioned that. Are there other areas where you think this approach might be the only way forward? I'm thinking of a conversation, in fact, you and I were having yesterday about enlargement in the context of the EU's democracy reform conversations. And we were talking about Ukraine and enlargement. And if a country tries to block enlargement, say the accession of Ukraine, could it be used? Or when you're coming to a new member state, is that an area where you'd have to say, no, we can't?
I think that if we actually get to the point where there is a strong conviction among almost all member states, when I say almost all, I mean 27 minus X with a very small x. If there's an agreement among all member states that a country like Ukraine or others, I think we should not limit it only to Ukraine. We should not commit the mistake, the geopolitical mistake of only committing it to Ukraine. So if we get to the point where we have individual member states government blocking the enlargement process, and let's not forget the enlargement process is subject to a lot of vetoes. It's an intergovernmental process. There's a discussion as to whether you can reduce those vetoes, but even here, this is very difficult to have this discussion. So this might be an area where you will require that those who are ready to support the accession of a country A or B to the EU to provide support outside of the EU treaties in a way which they haven't done ever before. That would be a very strong and difficult thing to do. It would also make accession to the EU less attractive. However, for an intermediate period, in order to progress, to give the strong signs to the country concerned, for example, Ukraine, it might be the only way. And we know that, yes, on issues of Ukraine, you have now one member state's government, Viktor Orban, leading it, who is obstructing, who ideologically, politically and ideologically thinks it would be a mistake to have Ukraine joining. So he's very much obstructing. If you want to overcome that, if it's only him, then there is a way to do that because you will put pressure.
Just to be clear, this is in terms of support for a country, not the. I mean, they can't join a club if the rules say to join this club.
Exactly.
It has to be unanimity.
And that is why I'm saying from today to the point where they can join, maybe or potentially the coalitions of the willing, if you want to call them that way, might be a way forward, but they cannot compensate for what actually needs to be done. But I started by saying it needs to be 27 minus X with a small x. The question is that X really that small? Or is it not that some member states
are hiding,
do not want Ukraine or any others to join the EU, by the way, for different reasons, some for very pro-integrationist, some for very anti-integrationist reasons. So if you get to that point, then whatever we're not talking about will not work.
So
it really depends on the readiness.
How illusory is the unity, and we might find out through this process the degree to which there is unity among many. On the second point, which is where it should not be used, you talked about there being certain principles that we need to adhere to, Fabian, and you said this morning you acknowledge the risks, and I'm thinking when you were talking earlier about potentially excluding member states, when you're talking about bypassing EU mechanisms, How do you see those risks? I mean, you say the risks are massively outweighed by the need to respond to these challenges. And you say this morning, you know, we can do this by careful design. What would that careful design look like, and where can this not be contemplated? Otherwise, the EU as we know it risks ceasing to exist.
Again, we have to go back to what do we need to achieve? And the answer cannot be that because we have blockages in the system, we simply do not do what we have to do. I was reminded very much as what was happening in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when we were trying to get a response together. Now, let's just take one example, sanctions, where there was a question, are we going to be able to ensure that all member states are on board, including Hungary? In the end, it worked. But what would have been the response if it hadn't worked, if we hadn't managed to get Hungary on board? Then the answer, in my view, would have had to be, then we would have gone ahead without them. And that is precisely what we're doing, for example, at the moment.
But sorry, could I just interrupt? Wouldn't that give a huge advantage to the member state that didn't join the sanctions, who would happily go on trading with the Russians and picking up business that the others were losing? Therefore, others might not want to go ahead because they're putting themselves at a disadvantage. Sorry to interrupt, but I see
No,
see a
absolutely.
problem
And
there.
the essence of what you've just described, the free riding problem,
Yeah.
is something which you will always have when you have these coalitions of the willing, which also means that there has to be thought, and that comes back to the question of how do we design those, that there's a cost of not taking part. There's a real drawback from sitting on the sidelines. And that can be, at the simplest level, that can be money. This, I think we will see also in the negotiations of the next multi-annual financial framework, that in many areas, the discussion will essentially be if we are not going to get consensus to use the money in a way which furthers our objectives, we will channel much of the money outside the multi-annual financial framework, excluding those who are not willing to go along. So there are real costs you can impose on the countries which are not taking part. But it also means that there can be consequences which reach deep into the DNA of the EU. And I think the one area where this becomes tricky, and that we've already seen in areas such as enhanced cooperation, is the single market. Because what we're really talking about here very often will touch the single market. And that's not only in terms of how do we deal with excluding member states from certain benefits of the single market, which is possible if we're doing it, for example, in defense and security, where we have security issues overriding other considerations, but also meaning that we will have to include non-EU members in some aspects of this, including the UK, for example, where we had a very acrimonious divorce, which in part precisely centered on the single market issue. So none of this is easy, but I would still come back to what is the alternative? And if the alternative is that we just don't do it, then we cannot afford to go down that route.
Okay. If you have any questions, don't forget, I did see one hand raised, but it's disappeared, so it may have been raised in error. But if you have a question, please do click on the raise hand button or write it in the Q&A box. Janis, in terms of those principles that we need to adhere to, and would you see areas where it is absolutely ruled out because it would not adhere to those principles?
Well, let me go through the principles which I think we need to adhere to, which we also try to define in the context of what we call the super-governmental avant-garde. One is that it needs to be open to all member states who are willing to join and are ready to respect the principles which I will just lay out, which, by the way, also means that if a member state joins and then no longer at some point is ready to adhere to the principle, there also needs to be some form of exclusion mechanism from the avant-garde, number one. Number two, there's a need to involve or even strengthen the role of EU institutions. So if you create this kind of an avant-garde, you need to involve the institutions, that's the minimum. But you should also try to seek ways how you could strengthen the role of EU institutions in the context of this avant-garde. If you go back to the Euro crisis, we had moments where we had to go intergovernmental, but EU institutions still played a role. And there are a lot who argue it strengthened the role of institutions, maybe not enough, and might have also partially undermined it, but at least they were involved, and that is an argument in the direction of the second principle. Third is that non-participating countries need to be constantly informed. You cannot exclude them from, once you have agreed to do that avant-garde, from what you're doing within the avant-garde. So that needs to be a minimum. Next point, you should refrain from setting up new permanent institutional parallel structures outside of the EU framework. You will require coordination in a governmental way, but you involve EU institutions so that there is this degree of intergovernmental cooperation which you will require, but that should not lead to permanent parallel institutional structures. That would undermine the EU itself.
So that idea you mentioned earlier, people who talk about a new union outside of the
I'll
current
talk about
framework.
that's something you should that would not adhere to these principles.
Exactly.
Clearly not adhere to these principles.
Yeah.
By the way, linking that to the previous response I gave to enlargement, there are also some who are speculating as to whether, if we get to a situation where one or two or three, whatever number of member states obstruct enlargement, whether the rest of the member states should exit the EU and at the same moment in time create a new union. I'm not saying this is likely. I'm just saying there is a thought experiment outside there, which is also trying to put pressure, by the way, on those who are potentially obstructing enlargement. Another fifth point is to integrate the legal norms which you establish outside of the EU treaty as soon as possible, to integrate them into the EU treaty framework. If you remember ESM, that was one of the conditions. Problem was that it was not so easy to adhere to them, and it didn't happen as quickly. But still, that needs to be a principle you need to follow. And the last one is something we already mentioned, is that you involve key non-EU countries and countries who aspire to join the EU. If you look into some of the things that have already been decided at the European level when it comes to defense, there was a quick reflect to say we need the UK involved, we need to have Norway involved, we need to find ways of dealing with Turkey. That's a mixed case, and I'll explain why it's a mixed case. These were the most obvious countries who you need when it comes to defense. There was not the same reflex with respect to potential future members, to candidate countries. That had to be put into the agreement that was found by some member states who were pressuring, including the candidate countries. So the openness needs to be also open to those who actually, we have told, have the prospect of joining the EU. That's why this avant-garde needs to be an open avant-garde. So these are 6 principles which we have defined. You can argue there are more. You can argue that some can be subsumed under the others. But I think that creates an impression of what you need. That would not include the creation of a new union outside of the EU structures, creating new parallel structures. That would undermine the EU as we know it. Not only the single market, as Fabian was indicating, that's something you need to be really careful about, would undermine much more than that. So one needs to be very careful about this.
And when it comes, we've talked about the free riding, Fabian, in the context of when we're talking about sanctions, and we're saying, what if one country does not apply them? You say, okay, the rest go ahead with that. What about free riding the other way, the non-EU countries? Is there a risk here that we start to say they are getting some of the benefits of EU membership without being members, which would suit country like the UK very nicely indeed. Is there a risk there as well, do you see? I mean, obviously for an aspiring member, it's slightly different. They are trying to join, they want to join, they're waiting for the EU to let them in. But in a case of a country that for the foreseeable future doesn't want to rejoin, do we need some principles also for where it is open to countries outside the EU and others where it won't be? Or, you know, how do we approach that issue? Is it blanket? The concept is one that allows non-EU members to join, or do we have to differentiate?
I think this is very much a question of what do we mean by coalition of the willing? I mean, clearly, we do only want countries to join if they are truly willing. And truly willing does not just mean being part of this, but also taking on the obligations which come with this, taking on also some of the principles. If you look at the principles Janis has just explained, some of these are not easy to take for the UK, for example, when we're talking about how close this is going to be to the institutions, how it is about essentially accepting a common jurisdiction, a common way of deciding, which is enforceable also on the countries taking part, excluding countries who are not following the principles. I mean, these are not easy obligations to take on for any country. I think what we are also seeing is, frankly, a re-evaluation within those countries. I do not expect that the UK will rejoin in the near future. But there is a very different debate now in the UK and even in places like Norway. There are many people in Norway now talking about EU membership, because when you live in a world where you have these outside threats, where you have these very, very difficult geopolitical and geoeconomic influences, then being part of a club, being together in addressing that, has become much more attractive. And I think in countries like the UK, in countries like Norway, they also see that they alone cannot address the issues which are there. They have to work together. And when it comes to many of the economic issues, you cannot do that without having some form of connection to the EU, given the competences the EU already has.
But again, as with EU membership, Janis, Fabian saying there, rights and obligations as well as benefits of joining. For you, is that the key to making sure that those principles you talk about are adhered to by non-EU countries, whether or not, and I speculate endlessly about whether the UK will ever rejoin the EU, but let's leave that aside for a moment. In terms of deciding where this can be done, it's, do they sign up to the principles is the key here to making sure that we get this right. Would you agree with that?
I think those who are participating in what we call the super-governmental avant-garde will have to adhere to these principles. Now, having said that, as with every principle, there's a question as to whether you can find some leverage in terms of how you interpret the principle for certain member states and for a certain period of time, which, by the way, also goes for those who potentially, like Norway, might at some point actually decide to ask for membership, or Iceland, which we haven't mentioned yet. So I think we need to stick to these principles, because if we don't, there's a risk that what we're talking about could actually undermine the EU substantially. And what I'm seeing is that a lot of member states prefer to go for it in a very loose way. They even would argue or tell you, representatives of certain governments would tell you, why do we have to get the EU involved? We can do this on our own. It does work, doesn't it? I think that one, for those who are already members of the European Union, it undermines the EU as it stands, which, by the way, goes back to the question you raised earlier of what dangers there might be linked to if you don't have coalitions of the willing. And the other thing is, look into certain developments which we've seen over the past months. For example, when it comes to Ukraine, support for Ukraine, meetings in London and Paris. You see that now the readiness to actually do what was said in February or March seemed to be less strong when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And I would argue that has also to do with the fact that this is being discussed very loosely in a very intergovernmental fashion. There's no one who is trying to make sure that it adheres not only to the principles we set out, but it adheres also to decisions which have already been taken. So sometimes the EU processes are very cumbersome and difficult, but they also create clarity and reliability. Whereas if it's purely intergovernmental, what was discussed a week ago or a month ago can be forgotten in a week or a month from today. So there are political and legal things and risks that need to be taken into account.
That's
I
interesting, because
just,
so we tend to focus on the risk of doing this, but there is also a risk in not doing this, and
Exactly.
not doing this in a structured way. Okay, let us turn in the last minutes we have available to, okay, let's be very, very concrete now about what do we do next, and how do we go about, not only you've begun to identify some of the areas where you think it can work, it can adhere to the principles, and it would be beneficial, or indeed the only option. In terms of formalizing that and having those conversations, what has to happen now to get agreement on where these coalitions might be formed? I mean, going back to your point about not doing it, it's sort of happening organically. How do you turn, Janis, to pick up, because you made that point at the end, how do you turn what is happening organically, and these conversations are happening organically, into something that will be more structured, and therefore you can make sure you adhere to the principles and so on? Where do we go from here?
I start to react to something you said in the beginning when you were posing the question. First of all, you need to have this debate, because if you don't have this debate and you think conceptually about this early on, when the moment comes where you are being put under pressure to deliver, you will not be prepared. So you need to have this discussion early on. And rather than talk about coalitions of the willing in an abstract form, you need to specify much more in detail what you mean. Because, for example, if you actually have some form of an agreement, I don't even know how to call it, found with respect to the war in Ukraine, if ever. And that agreement foresees also that the membership of Ukraine to the EU is not obstructed and can become reality, the pressure on the EU will increase to deliver. It will also, you will also see, and Fabian will probably respond to me by what I will be saying now. You will be some who say, well, if there's a deal, do we really have to have Ukraine integrated into EU? Which, by the way, would also be a historical mistake to give that signal. So you need to prepare for that moment. You need to think that through in order, when the moment occurs, which I don't think will be as organically, in the sense that it happens very slowly and we have time to take decisions. We need to go through one summit to the next. We might be under pressure to deliver much more, much faster. And that means that we need to prepare for that. And this discussion we haven't had, and this is why we're pushing this debate, in order to clarify what actually we want to do. For example, when it comes to Ukraine and enlargement, or when it comes to defense, when it comes especially to defense and extra EU funding for defense cooperation.
So is this, Fabian, something that an EU summit has to pick up and discuss? Or is it something that is started by particular member states who would be part of one of those coalitions? How do you see it happening in a way that is organized and structured, so that you make sure that you get this careful design that you've underlined is so important?
let me say, firstly, I don't think we necessarily have to start there, because as we have always said, it is preferable that we do some of these through the regular EU method. So what we should have is more bravery. Put these things on the table now, force member states to be honest about whether they support them or not, whether they are willing to sign up to them, so that we see whether it's possible to make advancements within the EU system at this moment in time. What we shouldn't do is to hold back, to say, but we probably won't get unity, so we won't even discuss it. That I think is the wrong way of going.
Which tends to be, it's always said a careful European Council president lays the ground and only makes a proposal if they are confident that it will receive backing. That's politically smart. You're saying no, put it on the table and see what happens.
I mean, not necessarily at the summit. I think a lot of this can be done behind closed doors, but it really is about asking the member states to show their cards, to be able to say, is there a possibility of going ahead? Is it the EU 27 minus a small x, or is it a more fundamental problem? In those areas where we have more fundamental problems, and I'm sure there will be a number of those because we are already starting to see it, and that, by the way, is an important consideration. This will happen anyway. If we don't design it properly, it doesn't mean it will stop. It will just go in a more chaotic and a more
Be more
unstructured
risky.
way.
Be more risky to the
In a
future
more
of the
risky
EU.
way.
Yeah.
But then I think it is for countries to sit down together with the institutions, and I hope the institutions would also be open to a process like this, to work out how could this look like? How do we concretely translate that into proposals on specific areas? That is a co-creation process, which should also involve people who have been thinking about these kind of processes. But it needs to be led by some member states who are looking at the current situation and clearly seeing certain things are not happening which need to happen.
So in the first instance, Janis, really an issue for the council president to establish, is this an area where we can advance together? But then it's for member states who particularly want to champion it to take it up and push it further. Would you agree with that?
Let me first add something to what Fabian said, because Fabian was saying in the beginning, and I concur with that, you need to have a discussion as to what you're ready to do within the EU framework. And if you come to the conclusion that something you cannot do, then look for alternatives. At the same time, and in parallel, I think you need to have a discussion of how could we do it in a different way and outside the treaties, because that might then also increase the pressure on those who are not ready to show the bold political will to move the debate forward, also in the pro-European camp. So it is a pressure instrument both ways, within and outside the EU framework. With respect to the President of the European Council and to the role of member states, well, always you need to have the combination, and you need to have those countries who are ready to lead to push in this direction, which, by the way, is interesting with the new German government.
I was about to
Depending on the SPD vote, which we need to still await. If it's positive, if Merz becomes chancellor, the new government comes into place with a heavy burden coming into office, by the way. Merz has said that he will invest much more into Europe. He has also discussed, also behind scenes, he's asked his associates, and they have discussed it with others, whether coalitions of the willing. Let's not forget that Merz was very close to Schäuble when he politically grew up, who was one of the fathers of the core Europe idea. So there were these ideas of, is this something we could now get out of the box in order to progress also at the European level? So there might be progress also coming from member states in line, hopefully, not only of Berlin and Paris, but also Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw. Not forget, Poland has the presidency of the council in these days. With respect to Costa, one of the things he has tried to put in place, different from those who have been in this office before him, especially the one directly before him, he has tried to have more of a strategic debate among heads of state and government, informal exchanges, with not leading to a concrete result, in order to discuss some of these more fundamental issues. Problem is that, as Fabian described them earlier, some of the enemies within the EU are then in the room. But maybe it still makes sense to have this open exchange and to discuss it. But you need to be brave for that. You need to have the courage to trigger these debates. And what I'm seeing from member states' side is that they don't have the courage, especially when you talk about EU reform. And the future of differentiation relates to the debate about EU reform. They're not ready to move and progress. They're hiding. They're not even having a debate about, how to use the passerelle clauses when it comes to QMV. They're hiding behind their scripts. So actually, I currently do not see that member states have the readiness in the Council, and by extension also in the European Council, to have that debate. We're trying to push them from our side, and a test of times, what we discussed yesterday in the conversation, goes in this direction with respect to internal reform and enlargement. But I don't actually see that they're ready to discuss. They're even hiding. They don't want to reveal the positions they have, if they have any.
Question from our audience, Fabian, really pointed to this potential threat to the future of the EU. Philip Hamradrutz talking about saying that in terms of defence, there seems to be quite broad support as the best way forward. But he questions, might this lead to the emergence rise of other thematic coalitions, for example, economic or geographical, replacing traditional European cooperation? Where would the traditional EU and its institutions end in this context? In-depth fragmentation. So really building on what we've been talking about in terms of that risk of it all unraveling if it goes into many areas. How would you answer, Philippe, on that?
Firstly, by pointing out that unless we start doing what we need to do, it's going to unravel anyway. Because if we are not going to deal with the existential threats which we have at this moment in time, then what we have created with the EU is not going to fulfill the primary purpose of why we have done all this. The prevention of war, the prevention of an attack from the outside, the guarding of our values, of our principles, of our interests. So this is a rather dramatic moment, and it should not be underestimated. And in no way do I want to minimize the risks which are there, but we have to really face that the worst case scenario is not what we are facing now. The worst case scenario is Russian boots in the Baltics, etc. So this is the kind of situation which we have to deal with. I think it will be impossible to prevent it from spreading. It is not something which can only be in defense and security, because we also live in a world where policy areas are not neatly put into categories like that anymore. One of the biggest questions I think we are going to have to face when it comes to defense and security is capital markets. We have to integrate our capital markets much more to be able to find the financing which is necessary for that. That means having common rules on certain things. It means a level of integration, by the way, also involving the UK, which will have a direct impact on the European Union. But I think if we do this well, it can also be something which in the medium term strengthens the union. Because if we can show that we can address these fundamental questions, then it shows that the union is still relevant for the kind of policy challenges which we are facing today.
Thank you very much. Janis, a quick final thought, if you would.
Just in addition, and referring also to Philip's question, we already talked about defense as a potential area, enlargement, anything related to financing outside of the EU framework. Let's not forget, if you look into the Draghi report, when it comes to economic competitiveness, the other major objective which we now have, to strengthen Europe's economic competitiveness, he raises the question within his report with respect to the need potentially for some member states going it by themselves. So he's talking about differentiation. He's not going into details, and he's not going into details in general when it comes to governance related issues or issues affecting EU governance, because he feared that that might undermine other messages of his report. But there's another area where there's potentially a need to discuss as to whether coalitions of the willing could help in order to progress among those countries who have the right mindset, as Draghi would probably say, because we have a lack of having the right mindset when it comes to implementing what he has asked for in his report still.
Thank you very much. That is all we have time for, but thank you very much for that. Just to highlight a couple of publications I mentioned during our discussion. The publication last November by Fabian and Janis and also Almut Muller, which kickstarted this conversation on a supragovernmental avant-garde. That was entitled Overcoming a Hollow and Illusory Unity. Last week, a publication, A Test of Times, Perma-Change Through Enlargement and EU Reform, that also looked into this issue as part of the debate about reforming the EU alongside preparing for enlargement, and that commentary of Fabian's published today entitled Radical Differentiated European Integration by Necessity. A couple of events coming up, one very much linked to what we're talking about. We talked about enlargement and how that might be impacted by this conversation. On Tuesday, Ukraine and Moldova's road to the EU, getting fit to open negotiating clusters, and an issue we didn't really touch on today, but we will come back to it, I am sure, in light of what happens next with the US and tariffs. Thursday, there is an event on trade, geopolitics, and the EU's global role in the era of uncertainty. And we will be back next month with another update. Thank you very much for joining us. If you are in countries that has a bank holiday tomorrow, enjoy the long weekend. And if you're in Brussels, enjoy the sunshine while it lasts. Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and see you again very soon.
Thank you.